I got a picture I got to show you that I'm really proud of. Most people show you pictures of their baby. This is my mother and father's baby. This was a picture taken in 1971. And, I wasn't a whole lot to look at, but I wanted you to see how good looking my mother is. I mean, you see that? My mother is a beautiful one, and my father, he's a pretty cool dude himself. And the reason I wanted to show you is give you something to look at, to picture, as I tell you just a little bit, very little bit, about my early home life. Thank God it was really good. I never had any problems till I started the school. Life was good at home. Parents loved me. Got to stay with my grandmother every day while my mother taught school, and I loved staying with her. She was a very special person in my life. And so, man, childhood for me, that was Eden. That was my Eden. That was my paradise. But first grade came along. In those days, you didn't have to go to kindergarten if you didn't want to. I did go to a kindergarten in a lady's house. I've actually got my kindergarten diploma on my wall now next to some other degrees, because it just reminds me where I came from. Always remember where you came from. Don't stay there. Keep going, but remember where you came from. That's where I came from. And what I'm getting at with this is that the advantage to having a good home life when you're little is those are formative years, yes. But there's a flip side. There's two sides to every coin. And for me, the hard part was, man, I didn't want to go to school or anywhere else. I liked it. I didn't want to have to change anything, but I had to. And so I will always remember the first day of the first grade. I went to this gigantic looking elementary school. It doesn't look so big when I drive by it now, but boy, it was huge at the time. And I'd heard about this place. I'd have known of people who'd gone there and lived to tell about it. And they would tell stories about it. I didn't really know what to expect. I just knew that some separation was about to happen. And that a phase of my life, which I loved, was about to end before I was ready for it to end. Somebody said years ago that all of our heartaches go back to one basic thing, and that is something ended before we wanted it to end. Well, that ended, and my daddy, he was a good daddy and still is. He walked me. We drove to school in his Michelin tire truck because it was bright yellow, and we had the Michelin man on the side. It was so cool to me. And he walked me through the hallways, and he took me to my desk, found out where I was going to sit, and I'll always remember he knelt down by my chair, and he said, "Now, Bubba," that's what he always called me. Still does. He said, "Now, Bubba, I'm going to leave now. I've got to go. I've got things I've got to do. I've got to go to work. And I want you to know that you're going to be okay, and I will be back for you. You are where you need to be right now, and you're going to learn some things that we can't teach you, and this is important. So work hard, pay attention, learn, make some friends, and at the end of the day, when the day is done, I'll be back for you." And I can still feel a little bit, there's still a little bit of the lump left in my throat from that morning as I watched him walk through the doors and disappear around the corner. And what a long day that was. And I tell you that because it may evoke some similar ending that you've experienced, something that ended before you wanted it to, and you found yourself in a new place where you didn't think you wanted to be. Whether it was good for you or not, some of the things that are best for you don't feel good, especially at first, especially as you're passing through. I heard this week, who was the wise man who said this? Life is lived forward and understood backward. Does anybody know what he's talking about? We live forward, but when we look back, do we really understand? Well, that fear of separation was really what this little story I told you was all about. Fear of separation. And you probably don't have an identical story. You don't need to. But you know what separation is. And you know what endings are like. And the fear of separation, especially from parents, the people that brought us into this world, is one of the deepest fears in the human soul. And it never entirely goes away. I've talked to many 50 and 60-year-old men and women who were healthy, financially secure, they were respectful, they had children of their own, good relationships with them, and their parents got older and older and aged and eventually died. And here's what so many of those people have told me. They said, when your mother in particular dies, and you wake up the next morning, the whole world is just a little different. Because that person who brought you into this world is no longer with you in this world. And nobody else. A lot of people may love you in a lot of ways. But nobody else will ever love you quite the way she did, especially the first time she held you. And you felt love. And you began to experience it. And certain situations bring up the separation anxiety, separation, the fear of separation, the sadness of something ending before we want it to. And a situation like that happened with the disciples of Jesus on the night before he died, the last night of his life. It was Passover. It was where he instituted the Lord's Supper. Judas had already left to go do whatever it was he needed to do. The supper was finished, and Jesus began to talk. And something about the way he was talking did not sound good on the ears of the disciples. It sounded like what it actually was. He was about to leave them. There was about to be a separation. I want to read a verse to you. John chapter 13, verse 33. John 13, verse 33. My children, I will be with you only a little longer. It was an interesting choice of words. My children, little children, some translations say. Because they were experiencing this child, they had a childlike trust in him, but they had this fear of separation. I'm going to be with you only a little longer. You would look for me, and just as I told the Jews, and so I tell you now, where I'm going, you cannot come. I'll say this first about these words of Jesus. Jesus was always honest and straightforward with his disciples. He was very realistic. He told them the truth about everything. He told them the truth about things that they received as good news, but he also told them the truth about things that must have seemed like bad news to them. My children, I'm only going to be with you a little longer. And where I'm going, you can't come. I couldn't go with my father to work that day. He had other things he had to do. I had things I had to do. Same was true with the disciples. They didn't feel they were ready for the responsibility that was about to be given them to share this message, to begin the process of sharing Christ with the world, and it worked, but they weren't ready for that. Remember, life is lived forward and understood backward. Only in looking back, from say our perspective, can we see what Jesus saw in advance. It's necessary that I go away. I'll go away, and there'll be another comforter that'll come, the Holy Spirit. And those 11 men turned the world upside down. But it wouldn't have happened as long as he was there babysitting them. He had taught them. They still had much to learn, but he had taught them what they needed. This phase was over. And so he didn't slip out on them. You ever had to do this with your kids or grandkids, or maybe you might even remember it being done to you. You know how kids that don't want to be left in the nursery or at the babysitters, I've seen it, and maybe I've done it, but I don't remember it if I did, but because I must have blocked it out. But you know how they'll take the kid in the nursery, they'll get the kid to play with some blocks or wrestling around with some little friend, and while the kid's occupied, they just kind of get on out of the room, so there won't be any drama. But there is drama once the kid realizes mama or daddy is gone, but they're not there. Jesus didn't do that. No slipping out. He told them very plainly. And so when he told them this, I'm going. Where I'm going, you can't follow. At least not now. It generated some questions, of course. Questions like any child would ask, were the kind of questions the disciples asked. Things like, well, okay, where is it you're going? Just where are you going? And why would you want to do that? Why can't you stay here with us? And the biggest one is, what's going to happen to us? What about us? How are we going to make it without you? And it's worth paying attention to that Jesus, in response to these questions, he did not give them a lot of specific answers about precisely what he was about to do, and he didn't predict the details of everything that was going to happen in their life. Instead, he gave them a promise to trust. It's a promise a lot like the one my father gave me. First day of school, kneeling by my desk. Bubba, I've got to go to work. You got to stay here, but I promise you, I'll be back for you. Look at these words of Jesus. John 14, verse 1, 2, and 3. He said to these little children, do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I'm going there to prepare a place for you? I'm not jacking you around here. If it were not so, I would not be promising you something that I can't deliver. If I go and prepare a place for you, I'll come back and take you to be with me so that you also may be where I am. You get it? I'm leaving, Bubba. You got things to do here, but I'll be back for you. I'll be back for you. That's a promise to the disciples, the first disciples, but to all disciples of Christ. A disciple is a student, a learner, which is what we are here. That's why we're here today. We're disciples. But now Peter had trouble with that. He tried to talk Jesus out of it. Even though Jesus didn't come right out yet and say, hey, I'm fixing to kick the bucket, okay? He didn't actually say it that way. Peter said, well, what do you... Be more specific, Jesus. And here's what Jesus said, 13:36. Simon Peter asked him, Lord, where are you going? And Jesus replied, where I'm going, you cannot follow now, but you will follow later. You know what he's talking about? Jesus is going through death's door. I'm about to pass through death's door and disappear around the corner and up the hall. And you can't go yet, Peter. There's a lot left for you to do yet, but you'll follow later. Now, I've given some thought to that, and I'm sure that has multiple layers of meaning, but the one that jumps out to me is, of course, Peter couldn't follow right now. He wasn't ready. Peter had been given a mission. And at present, on that night, he did not yet have the spiritual maturity to carry out that mission. And he proved that later that night when he denied Jesus 3 times. You know that story. He got so scared when somebody identified him with Jesus, who was on trial and about to get executed. He was so afraid that he was about to follow immediately, and he knew he wasn't ready. Or we can tell he wasn't ready because he dodged it, buddy. I don't even know the man. I don't look down on Peter. I've never been in that situation, especially not 3 years after I met Jesus. Of course he wasn't ready. And that really what the denial of Jesus, Peter's denial, it's not so much a sin as it was just a sign of where he was in terms of his maturity. And remember that when you fall, when you sin, when you make mistakes, yes, there are things you need to ask forgiveness for, things you need to make right, but every time you fall or fail, there's a lesson that comes with that. It shows you where you are in terms of your development. It's a demonstration. Here's where you are. Here's where you're weak. Here's where we need to work. That's a much more productive thing to do with our failures. He wasn't ready, but he had some growing to do. But the growing happened. And I've got strong belief about one of the main reasons Peter grew so rapidly. You know, this same Peter who denied Jesus the night before his execution, within a couple of months, he was preaching in the power of the Holy Spirit to thousands of people. And he got himself in trouble with the authorities, the very same authorities who had executed Jesus, the ones he'd been afraid of before the crucifixion. And yet he had this holy boldness about him. And he was arrested and flogged and thrown in jail. And when they released him the next morning, they said, listen, do not speak this man's name again. Do not say another word about this Jesus. And you know what Peter said? He said, oh, but we cannot help but share what we have seen and heard. Do you see the tremendous growth that took place? 2 things at least caused that growth. One was all his hopes in Jesus when he saw him crucified were dashed. He thought it was something that ended too soon. And it looked like an ending. But remember what we talked about last week. Every exit is also an entrance. And Jesus rose again, showed himself to his disciples, and meeting Jesus after the resurrection, that had such a profound effect on him that these same men, who at one point ran in every direction to protect themselves and not be identified with him. Did you know, of the 11, not counting Judas, all of them died as martyrs because of their faith, because they would not renounce him. They could not help. But there's something else. Peter experienced, after that denial, you know how it says, after he denied Jesus a third time, he heard the rooster crow, and he remembered Jesus' prophecy, and he went out and wept bitterly. Now, up until this point, Peter had always been the most confident of the disciples. What that did, that failure, demolished his ego. And the word ego is used in different ways by different people. Sometimes somebody that's arrogant will say he's got a big ego, and that's correct, but I'm not using it in that term. Our ego is, in this sense, it's the way we want to be seen. It's the image we want to project. It's who we want to be and try very hard to be and try even harder to make sure everybody else thinks that's who we are. But it's not our true self. And in order for us to really grow, the ego has to slowly die. As the ego dies and you're concerned about your image and what other people think and how you're looking and how you're coming across, you basically get yourself off your hands. And when that ego dies, the spirit grows larger. It happened. The ego has to die. It happened for Paul, too. Paul, before his conversion, you probably know this, he was as educated as a person could get in the first century. He had the equivalent of what we would now call a couple of PhDs. And he was a powerful leader in the Jewish religion, highly respected by his peers. He was thought well of. And people followed him to the point that they would carry out murders of Christians at his order. I mean, this is a man, talking about ego, power, influence, highly respected by his peers. But brother, when he was struck down on the road to Damascus and lost his sight and was helpless, and he met Jesus Christ and was converted, he had to go to the home. Jesus told him to go to the home. I think it was Cornelius. He had to go into the home of one of the very people he had been on his way to exterminate. Because this Cornelius, he's going to help you out, Paul. He's going to teach you what you need to know. Do you hear me? You hear that? Paul, academic, ultimate academic. Paul, this poor ignorant Christian is going to teach you what you need to know. His ego died. And it never arose. Not completely. You know, I don't think they ever completely go away. But they can certainly be tamed, is what it said. And Paul got to the point where the things that used to seem so important, his image, what people thought of him, didn't matter anymore. I want to read you what he wrote in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 8. I don't think I remembered to give this verse to the people with the screens, and so I'm going to read it to you from my Bible. Here's how he describes part of his experience as a Christian. Now, this is years after his ego death, years after he lost it all. You ever heard the word fortunate catastrophe? Melina and I went to a marriage counselor once that talked about fortunate catastrophes. A fortunate catastrophe is something that really was a catastrophe. And it really is bad, and we're not pretending that it wasn't, but it was fortunate because it allowed other things to happen that would not have otherwise happened. After his fortunate catastrophe, lost it all, and here's how he described himself. He said, I've experienced glory and I've experienced dishonor. I've experienced good report. That means people are talking well about me. I've experienced bad report, which means people are talking bad about me. I'm regarded as an imposter. I'm known and yet regarded as unknown. That is, the people who now know me don't take me seriously. Most of them don't. And the people whose admiration I once had, it's like I'm dead to them. They're so disappointed in me for converting. He said, we live on beaten, yet not killed, sorrowful, yet always rejoicing, poor, yet making many rich. And lastly, he said, having nothing, yet possessing everything. What's he talking about? He had none of the stuff that was once so important to him. Had nothing. Oh, but he possessed something now that he would never go back. He would never go back. Remember, life's lived forward, it's understood backwards. Remember that when you hit a fortunate catastrophe, when something ends before you wanted it to. Things do end before we want them to. I mean, do you know there are little deaths and resurrections that happen throughout the course of your life? And they've already happened. You just may not have thought of them in that way. But we've all experienced loss. We've all had to let go of things and people and places and positions. But think about it. You've had to let go of some things you once loved over and over and over, but you're still going and you're still growing. There is life after a separation. There's life after loss. And I want to give you some examples, real life examples. As a teenager, do you remember your first love that broke your heart? As you were moving forward, that was no fun. Looking back, well, that was a fortunate catastrophe. Your kids grow up, they leave home. Sometimes they move far away. That's a loss. There are kids who, in high school, I hear this a lot these days, a lot of kids in high school, especially their senior year, I don't want to grow up. Just be a Toys R Us kid. I don't want to grow up, because they realize that that's a big, tough world out there. Don't want to grow up. But we do. At least we grow up physically. Abraham Maslow, the psychologist, says most human beings never outgrow adolescence. And obviously, he doesn't mean physically. You get rid of the pimples and the squeaky voices and all. But not everybody outgrows adolescent thinking, adolescent attitudes, adolescent irresponsible ways of dealing with reality and with life. But the practice of having to let go of things we don't want to let go of, that's a little death. That's a miniature death. And if you fight that, you'll be fighting your whole life, and in the end you'll lose. But if you can learn to surrender when the inevitable happens, for example, just getting old. Larry and Sharon from Muskogee reminds me there's a little boy. I used to be his pastor in Muskogee, Oklahoma, and he would always sit on the front row and keep his eyes on me. Nobody else in the church wore a suit, but he had the full suit on. It's like he was going to be a preacher or something. I haven't seen him since I left there close to 5 years ago. But recently his mother called me. She said, I wanted you to know. She said, we went to your church Facebook page, and I showed Alonzo your picture. And you know what he said? Oh, Pastor Lance looks old. And you know what I knew? Something's died here. And I knew that kids, they call it like they see it. That wasn't an insult to him. That was just a very obvious observation. And I had to grieve that loss a little, you know. And letting go of things that we must ultimately let go of anyway is a spiritual practice that leads to maturity. Letting go as opposed to hanging on for dear life. Because there are things we can't hang on to. The only thing we can hang on to for dear life is the one we better hang on to for dear life, and that's Christ himself. Because anything else we hang on to will eventually lose. Remember, Jesus said, if you seek to save your life, you'll lose it. In the process of trying to save it. You're trying too hard, in other words. He also said, if you refuse to let go, you'll lose it. Life is like water cupped in the hands. You can't hold it there forever. You just better go ahead and drink it. And in fact, if you try to hold your water in your hands too long and too hard, you'll squeeze it and it'll squirt out between your fingers. People do that kind of thing every time something has to end and they don't want it to. But that's how we grow. Now, I told you about my experience at school, and I'm understanding life backwards now, and I understand that though that wasn't fun that day, my daddy knelt and left me, and I watched him disappear through the door, and I had a lump in my throat. Thank God he left me there, because there was something way worse than me having to stay there, and that would have been me not staying there. Because there, I learned, I grew, I learned to read. And guess what? My first grade teacher, years later when I became a preacher, she came to my church. And she's the one that taught me to read the Bible. I grew, I learned, I developed in ways I never would have back at my grandmother's house, playing little cowboys and Indians. I used to say, my grandma and I played, my favorite thing to play, we played cowboys and Indians. She finally outgrew it. I never did. But, I would have never gotten beyond that. Remember, every exit is also an entrance. And accepting loss is necessary for your continued spiritual growth. When you let these things die that are going to die anyway, then you find a resurrection, so to speak. You let go. Joseph Campbell used to say, you have to let go of the life you have in order to reach out and take hold of the life that is waiting for you. There's an old Plains Indian proverb that says, the heart of the seed must burst in order for the grass to grow. Only when you look backwards in life do you see the ways you grew. Now, this growth we're talking about, I got to wrap up. Let me say this. Jesus said, I'm coming back for you. Trust me. Trust me. In my Father's house are many dwelling places. Some translations say many rooms. or many mansions. You ever wonder what those mean? Because it's stated in different ways in different translations. It might interest you to know that throughout Christian history, different teachers and theologians have understood this passage in different ways. And I'm not saying they're right on what I'm going to share, but I came across something recently that piqued my interest. I've been talking about how we grow throughout life, and in order to grow, you must die to something. In order to live into what's next, you have to leave one place in order to get to a new place. Well, and as you've heard me say before, you leave one door, you leave one room, the door slams behind you and locks. You can't go back. And you're going to spend some time in the hallway. That's the scary part. But the hallway is going to lead somewhere. You'll find a door. Jesus, by the way, said he is the door. Well, here's what Origen, one of the early church fathers, lived. Origen lived from 184 to 253. One of the most influential Christian theologians in church history, in the formation of the church. Here was his understanding of that. He said these dwelling places are stages through which we continue to advance, even in the life to come. It's not something that you don't just plateau after that. That's his idea. He said that there, in his belief, when a person dies, they immediately go to a level called paradise. Jesus said to the thief on the cross, "Today you'll be with me in paradise." And the way Origen interpreted that is that there's progression even after death. Paradise is the first place, which is still, in his belief, somehow within the earthly realm, only in a different dimension. And that advancement continues as we develop spiritually. That's one of many ways this is interpreted. I'm not asking you to swallow that. I'm chewing on it myself. But it's interesting to know how many different ways so many different Christians throughout history have understood the same scriptures that we have. Stages along the way. Now, that brings me to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. You may know her from her writing. She wrote the book, Death and Dying. And she was the person who first came up with the 5 stages of grief that everybody goes through when they experience a loss, separation, and you remember denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then finally acceptance. After writing that book, she became famous and she lectured widely in universities and medical schools, and then she got interested because so many people she talked to who were nearing death had these near-death experiences where they almost died, or maybe they partly died, and they came back, and she interviewed thousands of these people. And slowly, she, who did not start out a Christian, began saying, hey, there's some striking similarities between these stories. The details are often different, but there's some basic things that happen. I want you to see what she wrote. She actually talks about stages. Apparently, she believed there were stages beyond, based on her research. She said, those who progressed to stage 3 encountered a divine being of light. Now, who would that be? What does the Bible say? God is light. As they got closer, they felt the light radiating intense warmth, energy, and love. Love most of all. People reported that its force was overwhelming. They felt excitement, peace, tranquility, and the anticipation of finally going home. What was that Jesus said? I'm going to prepare a place for you. that where I am, there you will be also. What was it my daddy said? Bubba, I'm going to be back, and tonight we'll go home together. Well, the end of that day finally came. And when the bell rang, the teacher escorted us through this hallway. And out at the end of that hallway was a bright light. And I'm not joking. It was nothing supernatural about it, but it was this long, dark corridor we walked through. And the doors opened up onto a porch overlooking the parking lot, where the parents would circle through, picking up their kids. So I walked up that hallway. What if he's not here? He said he would come back for me. He said we'd be home tonight. And that knot came back in my lump, got back in my throat. I walked out on the porch, and I started looking, and whoop, it jumped out at me. A bright yellow Michelin tire truck. And the man inside, waving and grinning like Andy Griffith. And we went home that night. And one day, you'll go home. Don't fight it. Don't fear it. The way you prepare, though, to be ready for your final death, leaving this world, is to learn now how to accept the inevitable separations and losses that come, and find life on the other side. Find new relationships. Keep living. Keep growing. Do that. And by the time you reach the ultimate death, you will be very practiced up. And you will find this is just one more stage. I've done all I could do here, but there's more. And every exit is an entrance.